long. So I thought the keynote speech was a great way to kick off the day, and we're going to pick up right where that left off. So Sir Adam Thomson, he started off by pointing out that we are at an inflection point with new technologies, some new and emerging threats, and geostrategic shifts. And so this panel is going to continue that conversation and talk about some of those specific issues. And I'm delighted to have our three speakers here. We're going to, they're each going to speak for about 10 minutes each. I'm not going to read through all their bios because you have them, and we are trying to leave as much time as possible for discussion at the end. And so to get us started right away is Alex Velez-Green, who is a research associate at CNAS, and we'll be talking about the collapsing battlespace, the impact of emerging military technologies on the NATO-Russian nuclear relationship. Alex, do you want to kick us off?
Sure thing. Well, first of all, good morning. As Dr. Williams mentioned, my name is Alex Velez-Green, and I would say first, thank you so much for having me here today with you. So to start, the military technological environment is always changing, but today, as we've sort of touched upon already, it is changing faster and in more ways than it has before. A series of novel military technologies are set to enter the field by 2040. They include cyber, counterspace, and autonomous weapons. They also include hypersonic missiles, as well as electromagnetic railguns and directed energy weapons. And these may sound like science fiction, but they're either real or likely to become real in the coming decades. And the arrival of these technologies threatens to destabilize the NATO-Russian nuclear relationship. In this brief, I'll provide an overview of the technological trends in question, then I'll dive into their implications for NATO-Russian nuclear stability, and I'll wrap up with recommendations for NATO policymakers seeking to mitigate their destabilizing effects. The first two emerging technologies of concern are cyber and counterspace weapons. Both NATO and Russia see the decisive role that cyber weapons will play in future conflicts. Russia demonstrated this early on when it used cyber attacks to disrupt the Georgian military's response to its invasion in 2008, and NATO is investing heavily in its own cyber warfare capabilities. The outer space domain is likewise being militarized at a growing rate. Both the United States and Russia are building what we would call counterspace arsenals. These arsenals include anti-satellite missiles. Russia has also deployed what we'd call kamikaze satellites that can be used to ram enemy targets. And both sides have non-kinetic options, such as jammers and lasers. The United States and Russia are also developing hypersonic missiles, electromagnetic railguns, and directed energy weapons. And other NATO members are working on some of these technologies as well. Hypersonic missiles are designed to allow their users to kinetically strike any target on Earth far more rapidly than ever before. And these weapons are still in development, but they may take the form of boost glide systems, which are gliders that are rocket launched to the edge of Earth's atmosphere before gliding back into ground targets at speeds above Mach 5. Or they might take the form of scramjet-powered hypersonic cruise missiles. Electromagnetic railguns and directed energy weapons are also still in development. Railguns would use magnetic fields to hurl shells at speeds up to Mach 6, and directed energy weapons would use concentrated electromagnetic energy to disable or destroy enemy targets. And many researchers think that these systems may enter the field in the next few decades, and if and when they do, if and when they are fielded, they could be used as either highly cost-effective standoff weapons or even to augment ballistic missile defenses. Finally, NATO and Russia are both investing heavily in a range of autonomous military systems. On one end of this spectrum, these systems include highly automated data processors, which allow human operators to take command of and operationalize far larger quantities of data than they ever could before. On the other end, they include uninhabited strike assets, which many of us are more familiar with, operating on land, in the air, and at sea, as well as in cyberspace and outer space. It's important, particularly at this conference, to note now that neither the United States nor Russia have ruled out using unmanned systems, particularly unmanned bombers, for the nuclear mission. So why should the advent of these technologies matter to NATO? I would argue that there are two primary reasons. First, the near simultaneous introduction of these technologies will increase the risk of inadvertent escalation between NATO and Russia. And it will do this by collapsing the battlespace and making it more difficult for states to set effective red lines. These technologies may also lower the nuclear threshold by tipping the conventional military balance or directly threatening states' nuclear deterrence. To the first point, cyber, non-kinetic counterspace, and hypersonic missiles in particular will allow states to attack one another with very little warning. The same weapons will also allow actors to strike farther with their initial strikes. For instance, Russia could use cyber or counterspace attacks from the very outset of a conflict to disrupt U.S. military transport in North Carolina or degrade communications across Europe. And this ability to strike farther, faster, will effectively collapse the battlespace, bringing a far larger number of targets into immediate danger. This dynamic, in turn, could create a heightened sense of vulnerability, which may impel policymakers on both sides, both in Moscow as well as in NATO capitals, to act more rapidly or hastily, as some might characterize it, in crisis. And this will leave less time for them to determine whether a perceived threat is real and to design and enact a proportionate response. And this would set the stage for a higher risk of inadvertent escalation. That risk is compounded by the fact that these technologies would only thicken the fog of war. In other words, these capabilities are so new, and there has as yet been so little dialogue about them, that it will be difficult for states to set clear and credible red lines for their use, particularly early on, particularly shortly after they've been fielded. A lack of clearly defined red lines would, again, substantially increase the risk of inadvertent escalation. For instance, the United States might use hypersonic missiles to destroy targets in Kaliningrad in the context of future limited regional conflict, perhaps due to a contingency in the Baltics. But it might do so without realizing that Moscow would likely see the very use of these weapons as an indication that NATO were preparing for a larger decapitation strike or strategic disarming strike. At the same time, these technologies may lower the nuclear threshold in at least two distinct ways. First, they are likely to exacerbate the NATO-Russian conventional military imbalance. If NATO is first to deploy systems like electromagnetic railguns, directed energy weapons, and robotic swarms, it might be able to use these systems not only to dismantle Russia's defenses in the event of conflict, but to seriously erode Russia's ability to fight back with non-nuclear weapons. And this is something that Russian strategists are deeply concerned by today, and it is just this type of conventional mismatch that is a recipe for greater reliance on nuclear weapons by the weaker party. This was the basis for NATO's flexible response doctrine earlier on in the Cold War, and it's also a reason why many Russian strategists are arguing today for Moscow to adopt a doctrine of strategic preemption. In addition, emerging technologies may pose direct threats to states' nuclear deterrence. They could do so by targeting states' nuclear command and control systems, or NC2. For instance, again, as was alluded to earlier, U.S. policymakers are concerned that Russia may one day be able to use cyber weapons to temporarily disable our NC2, leaving us vulnerable to a first strike. Counterspace jammers or lasers could be used similarly to blind enemy NC2 satellites with little warning. Novel technologies may also allow states to target opponents' nuclear delivery vehicles in new ways. As Paul Bracken has written very compellingly, highly automated data processors might allow states to more effectively track and target mobile missiles. There's also the possibility that uninhabited undersea vehicles may one day be able to track and target enemy nuclear submarines. Finally, electromagnetic railguns and directed energy weapons might one day significantly enhance ballistic missile defenses. And this would seriously exacerbate Russian fears that NATO is pushing for a strategic first strike advantage. To put this in context, Russian strategists today fear that the United States will use hypersonic missiles to destroy most of their strategic forces while they're still on the ground or in port, and then follow up with these advanced ballistic missile defenses to mop up any missiles that are able to get through that initial Western barrage. Now, importantly, we must note that none of these threats need to be real for them to be destabilizing. It's enough for a state to think that one or more of these technologies could threaten its nuclear deterrent for it to have a destabilizing effect. In this case, that effect would be best understood as increased use or lose pressures. To put that another way, if Russia or the United States, United Kingdom, and France don't use their nuclear weapons early on in a crisis or conflict, they may find themselves disarmed by an enemy first strike. NATO must maintain a strong deterrent against Russia, but it must do so in ways that mitigate these destabilizing trends. To that end, I would submit that NATO should focus first on mitigating new ambiguity in the strategic environment. This would include dialogue with Russia to establish rules of the road for cyber and counterspace operations in particular. All parties, in NATO and Russia, should likewise take steps to promote the responsible use of military autonomy. And this means, in particular, working to identify and limit destabilizing uses of this technology, such as the use of unmanned assets, unmanned strike assets, for the nuclear mission. And policymakers must also give special attention to emerging threats to the US, UK, French, and Russian nuclear deterrence. This means sustaining engagement, in particular with Russia, on NATO ballistic missile defenses, as well as taking steps to limit the size of America's and Russia's future hypersonic weapons stockpiles. And finally, NATO should prioritize improved resilience in force structure, posture, and doctrine. Increased resilience would give NATO policymakers more time to evaluate the veracity of a threat and design a tailored response in the event of crisis or conflict. And it may also help to dissuade Moscow from an attempt at strategic preemption by decreasing the likelihood of a successful disarming first strike. With that, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. That was a running start, I feel like, for this panel. And so next we have Andrea Howard, who is an MA candidate at the University of Oxford and with the U.S. Navy, and will be speaking on "Though She Be But Little, She Is Fierce?" Question mark. Non-strategic nuclear weapons in crisis management. Andrea, we're so happy to have you here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There we go. Well, good morning. I attended my first RUSI event 2 years ago when I arrived in the UK for my graduate education. And I just remember thinking that it'd be incredible if I was important enough someday to have the opportunity to speak here. I'm certainly not important enough yet, but nonetheless, I'm really grateful and humbled to be here and to be in this tremendous venue with some really high caliber peers. So Alex, like we said, he sped it up really quickly, and I'm going to kick it old school and have us take a look backwards, and I think that will help inform the look forwards that we're trying to achieve in this conference. So this project follows two bits of logic that I acquired over the years. The first piece of reasoning helps answer the question posed here. How can a major power make credible an attempt to defend a smaller ally from attack by another major power? My ethics coursework in college and the submarine corps I'm about to enter promote the logic that if you want peace or deterrence, prepare for war. But another piece of logic that I picked up in grade school contributes. That's that big things come in small packages like me. So the same can be said for non-strategic nuclear weapons, and history shows that these weapons platforms can perform two roles. The first is upholding an extended deterrence relationship between a defender and a pawn to then reduce the aggression of an attacker against the third-party pawn, depicted by our mouse here. This can work even when the aggressor has local conventional superiority, as with our elephant. Although there is no universally accepted definition of non-strategic nuclear weapons, this project focuses on the intended battlefield use of these weapons, wherein the yields and ranges could deny an aggressor the ability to achieve objectives on the tactical level. Especially under President Eisenhower, strategic weapons, on the other hand, came to be seen as unusable because of their massive yields and the escalation risk they posed. This project notes, though, that non-strategic weapons prove more useful because threats of their use have historically reduced the aggression of an attacker on a third party, without the seemingly inevitable escalation risk of threats to use strategic weapons on cities or industrial centers. So I used the logic of Mill's comparative method of difference to explore 4 different cases involving non-strategic nuclear weapons. This method demands, though, that all of the main characteristics of the cases are nearly identical, save the potential differentiating factor, in this case, the issuing of threats of non-strategic nuclear weapons use. So I looked for uniformity, and there were sort of 4 criteria that popped up. An extended deterrence relationship, the presence of non-strategic nuclear weapons ready for firing, the involvement of the United States, and that the crisis took place between the first successful Soviet nuclear test, which broke the American monopoly, and also before 1962, after which the Cuban Missile Crisis arguably scared the superpowers into a type of nuclear détente. Less threats were issued. So the cases are listed here of the Korean crisis, the first and second Taiwan Strait crises, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of note, each case was actually a crisis in which the actors involved acknowledged that a threat of escalation existed and that the threat required urgent, immediate attention. The first three cases will serve as positive cases, so an explicit threat of tactical nuclear weapons use was issued. The Cuban Missile Crisis, though, is a negative case, as the Soviets did not issue an explicit threat of tactical nuclear weapons use as the defender. So just to keep me honest, I've listed some of the warheads and delivery platforms that could have been employed by the defender in each of these crises. So the capability portion of these threats was credible. As a spoiler alert on the resolve side, for each of the positive cases in which an explicit tactical nuclear threat was delivered, the attacker exhibited signs of significant, immediate, lessened aggression within 50 days of the threat's delivery. I define this as an expressed willingness to negotiate the end of the crisis, the signing of an agreement to terminate the crisis, the suspension of a specific military activity, or an increased emphasis on defensive measures. What I then tried to do, though, was to use a discourse analysis to determine how the threats of tactical nuclear weapons used by the defender translated into lessened aggression by the attacker. So the explicit statements in the study were categorized into light or heavy threats based on 4 criteria: the probability of retaliation, the level of escalation associated with the potential retaliation, the interpretation of the crisis severity, and the attempt to conventionalize tactical nuclear weapons. So due to time constraints, I want to just briefly show how this discourse analysis worked before addressing some of the background of the crises and the outcomes. So the 2 statements that were issued for the Korean crisis were both what I called light statements. Eisenhower's statement was extremely light in that it only mentioned a low probability consideration of use. And in the message conveyed by Dulles, there was still less than 100% certainty of retaliation, as well as a flexible level of stronger retaliation. The retaliation wasn't defined clearly. Nonetheless, the crisis soon thereafter ended with agreements on prisoner of war repatriation and the armistice in July. For the first Taiwan Strait crisis, the first statement was light, and the second 2 listed here were what I called heavy. So the vice president's statement, for instance, increases the probability of retaliation to near certainty with the phrase "will be used." And the admiral's use of destroy indicates a firm, higher level of escalation against China. After all the threats were issued in a short window of time, the Chinese communists then reopened negotiations and suspended shelling of the offshore islands. And now that you have a sense for how this discourse analysis works, I won't explicitly dissect these 2 heavy statements for the second Taiwan Strait crisis, but their delivery correlated with a reopening of peace talks and a more permanent establishment of a ceasefire plan. So note, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the only case in which the defender had to capitulate in some of its objectives. It was the negative case. The Soviet Union had to make a humiliating withdrawal of the missiles in Cuba, and Khrushchev's political career paid the price. Note, too, that the U.S. discovered the presence of tactical lunar rockets near the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and only at that point the U.S. attacker fully discounted the invasion option of response. Engaging a little bit in the counterfactual realm, had the Soviet Union disclosed the presence of the FKR cruise missiles, a secret that was kept for 50 years, and issued an explicit threat of TNW use earlier in the crisis, perhaps the U.S. would have not considered the invasion option or operated at the brinkmanship level, and the Soviets might not have needed to capitulate with a full withdrawal of missiles. But because of the methods used, the study just can't prove causation, but it does note some really interesting correlations. First, the use of threats correlated with the defender achieving its objectives. In the Korean crisis and 2 Taiwan Strait crises, the U.S. hoped for a return to the status quo,